The television studio fell silent as Jasmine Crockett reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small recording device. Across from her sat Jordan Peterson, the famous psychologist and author, his face frozen in disbelief. Just moments before, he had called her completely unfit for public office and questioned her intelligence on live television. Now, with millions watching, Crockett was about to play an audio recording that would turn Peterson's world upside down. "Dr. Peterson," she said calmly, her finger hovering over the play button, "before we continue this discussion about fitness for office, I think America needs to hear something you said when you thought nobody was recording." Peterson's confident smirk vanished. The host leaned forward. The audience held their breath. What happened next would become the most watched political confrontation of the year, sparking a national debate about hypocrisy, power, and truth in American politics. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these explosive political moments that are reshaping our country. The recording device clicked, and everything changed. To understand how this confrontation reached such explosive heights, you need to know the two people sitting across from each other in that studio that night. Jasmine Crockett had become one of the most talked-about freshman representatives in Congress. At just 42 years old, the former civil rights attorney from Texas had already made waves with her sharp questioning during committee hearings and her ability to cut through political nonsense with laser-focused precision. Her background wasn't typical for Washington. She'd grown up in a working-class family, put herself through law school, and spent years fighting for people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers. But Crockett had also become a target. Conservative commentators regularly attacked her speaking style, questioned her qualifications, and suggested she was out of her depth in the halls of Congress. Some of the criticism crossed lines that made many Americans uncomfortable, with undertones that seemed to have less to do with her policies and more to do with who she was. On the other side sat Dr. Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist who had become a global phenomenon. With millions of followers hanging on his every word, Peterson had built an empire around his philosophy of personal responsibility and traditional values. His books topped bestseller lists, his speaking tours sold out arenas, and his online lectures garnered millions of views. Peterson had recently expanded his commentary into American politics, particularly targeting what he called the radical left takeover of institutions. He'd become increasingly vocal about politicians he believed were destroying Western civilization, and Jasmine Crockett had become one of his favorite targets. The tension between them had been building for months, creating a slow-burning conflict that political observers had been watching with growing interest. Peterson had made several public statements questioning Crockett's intelligence and fitness for office. He'd suggested during interviews that she was a perfect example of how identity politics was putting unqualified people in positions of power. Each comment had gotten more personal, more pointed, and more dismissive. The escalation had begun during Crockett's first major committee hearing, where she had questioned a witness about discriminatory lending practices. Her line of questioning had been sharp and well-informed, leading to significant policy changes within weeks. But Peterson had appeared on several programs afterward, suggesting that her performance was more about performance art than serious governance. "What we saw in that hearing," Peterson had said during one particularly memorable television appearance, "was someone who had clearly been coached on what questions to ask, but who lacked the deeper understanding necessary to follow up appropriately. It's the difference between reading from a script and actually understanding the material." The comment had stung because it played into every stereotype about young politicians, particularly young politicians from marginalized communities. It suggested that Crockett's success was not the result of her own intelligence and preparation, but rather the product of behind-the-scenes coaching and identity-based promotion. Crockett's response at the time had been measured and professional. She had issued a brief statement, noting that she had written her own questions, done her own research, and achieved the policy outcomes she had promised her constituents. But privately, those close to her said, the attack had crystallized her. understanding of what she was really facing. This wasn't just policy disagreement or normal political opposition. This was a systematic attempt to delegitimize her presence in Congress by questioning her fundamental competence. Peterson wasn't just disagreeing with her positions, he was arguing that she shouldn't be taken seriously as an intellectual equal, that her achievements were somehow artificial or unearned. The attacks had continued over the following months, each one slightly more personal than the last. Peterson had questioned her educational background, despite her law degree from a prestigious university. He had suggested that her success as a civil rights attorney was due to lowered standards in legal education and practice. He had even questioned whether she understood the historical and philosophical foundations of the democratic system she had sworn to defend. Each attack had been carefully crafted to avoid explicit references to race or gender, but the